Every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over the White Mountains of New Hampshire in the deep of February. It's a heavy, insulating silence, where the snow seems to absorb all sound, and the cold air is so thin, it feels like it could shatter. It's the kind of quiet that makes the snap of a twig sound like a gunshot. On the night of February 9, 2004, along a lonely stretch of Route 112 known as the Wild Amanuensis Road, this profound silence was briefly broken by the sound of metal meeting snow, of a car losing its fight with an icy corner. A black 1996 Saturn sedan came to rest, not in a ditch, but awkwardly, facing the wrong direction against a snowbank, its nose pointed west in the eastbound lane. The car was damaged, but not destroyed. Its hazard lights were not on. The doors were locked. Inside, a box of wine was spilled on the passenger seat. A favorite stuffed monkey hung from the rearview mirror, and an open bottle of alcohol was visible. A AAA card was tucked into the visor, bearing the name Maura Murray. But Maura Murray was not there. She had vanished into that cold, silent night, leaving behind a puzzle that would not only confound investigators for decades, but would also become a landmark case for an entirely new kind of investigation, one conducted not on the frozen ground of New Hampshire, but in the glowing infinite corridors of the Internet. What happened to Maura Murray is a question with 1,000 different answers, and none at all. It's a story of a young woman who, in the 48 hours before she disappeared, seemed to be methodically, if chaotically, erasing herself. But it's also the story of what happens when a mystery enters the digital age. It's about the birth of the online sleuth, the rise of the true crime podcast, and the double-edged sword of crowdsourced investigation. Maura's physical trail went cold within minutes of her crash, but her digital trail, the breadcrumbs of her life left in emails, search histories, and phone calls, became the seeds of a sprawling, often contradictory and deeply obsessive public narrative. Today, we dissect the anatomy of a digital ghost. We will explore the case of Maura Murray, not just as a missing person investigation, but as a crucible for modern mystery, where the search for one person became a search for meaning in the static, and where the most important question shifted from "Where is Maura?" to "Who do we believe she was?" To understand the ghost, you must first understand the person. Maura Murray was, by nearly every external measure, a portrait of success and potential. Born in 1982, she was the fourth of Fred and Lori Murray's 5 children, raised in Hanson, Massachusetts. She was a gifted athlete, a talented runner who excelled in high school track. She was academically bright, driven, and by all accounts, deeply loved by her family. Her ambition was evidenced by her initial choice of college, the United States Military Academy at West Point, a notoriously demanding institution that accepts only the most resilient and disciplined candidates. Maura was one of them. She entered West Point to study chemical engineering, following in the footsteps of her older sister Julie, who was also a cadet. For a time, she seemed to thrive in the rigid, structured environment. But beneath the surface of the star athlete and promising cadet, there were signs of pressure and perhaps a hidden struggle. In her sophomore year at the academy, Maura was caught stealing makeup, valued at less than $5, from a post commissary. At West Point, the cadet honor code is absolute. A cadet will not lie, cheat, steal, or tolerate those who do. The infraction, while minor in the civilian world, was a catastrophic breach of this code. Faced with expulsion, Maura chose to withdraw from the academy. she transferred to the University of Massachusetts at Amherst to enroll in their prestigious nursing program. To her family and friends, it seemed like a fresh start. She was closer to home, pursuing a career of compassion, and she continued to excel academically, making the dean's list. She was in a long-term relationship with her West Point sweetheart, Billy Rausch. They had their ups and downs, like any young couple navigating a long-distance relationship after Billy graduated and was commissioned into the U.S. Army, but they were planning a future together. On the surface, Maura had successfully navigated a major life setback and was back on a path to a bright future. But the pattern of quiet trouble, of inexplicable choices under pressure, had not entirely disappeared. In November of 2003, just 3 months before she vanished, Maura was arrested for improper use of a credit card. She had found or been given a card that wasn't hers and used it to order food from several local restaurants. The charges were minor and were set to be dismissed after 3 months of good behavior. It was another strange, out-of-character act of petty crime for a young woman who seemed to have everything to lose. Was it a cry for help, a symptom of an undiagnosed issue like kleptomania, or was it simply the poor judgment of a college student feeling overwhelmed? The court date for the dismissal of these charges was scheduled for late February 2004, a date she would never keep. The shadows deepened in the week leading up to her disappearance. It was a week marked by accidents, emotional distress, and a series of actions that, in hindsight, look like a countdown. On the night of Thursday, February 5th, Maura was at work at her campus job, monitoring security at a UMass dorm. Around 10:30 p.m., she was on the phone with her older sister, Kathleen. The conversation was, by Kathleen's account, deeply upsetting. Maura was quiet at first, almost catatonic. Then she broke down crying. Kathleen would later describe her sister as being completely distraught. The content of that conversation has never been made public, but whatever was said, it left Kathleen so worried that when Maura finally hung up, Kathleen immediately called her other sister, Julie, to share her concern. Something was profoundly wrong. Just a few hours later, in the early morning hours of Friday, February 6th, another strange event occurred. Maura's boyfriend, Billy Rausch, who was stationed at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, had a conversation with her on the phone. He later told investigators he believed she had been drinking and that she mentioned her sister, Kathleen, had been in a fight with her husband. Billy tried to calm her down, and they ended the call with a plan to speak again later that day. Then, on Saturday, February 10th, Maura's father, Fred Murray, arrived in Amherst for the weekend. He'd been helping Maura look for a new, more reliable used car. They spent the day car shopping and then went out for dinner. Later that evening, Maura borrowed her father's new Toyota Corolla to go to a dorm party with a friend. Fred stayed behind at his motel. At 2:30 a.m., Maura left the party. At 3:30 a.m., she was driving back to her father's motel when she struck a guardrail on Route 9 in Hadley, causing nearly $10,000 in damage to the car. The police officer who responded to the scene did not conduct a field sobriety test. He simply had the car towed to a local garage and gave Maura a ride to her father's motel. Fred Murray would later say his daughter was shaken and upset, but not intoxicated. The accident report, however, would note that the cause was inattention and that she had overcorrected. This was the backdrop to Maura's final 48 hours. A troubling credit card charge hanging over her head, a deeply emotional breakdown on the phone with her sister, and now a serious car accident in her father's brand new car. For a young woman who had already washed out of West Point, This cascade of failures and stressors must have felt immense. The pressure was building. On Sunday, February 8th, Fred Murray dealt with the insurance paperwork for his wrecked Toyota. He rented a car, and at some point, he and Maura had a conversation about the accident. Fred has always maintained that he was not angry, that he told her it was just a car, and not to worry about it. Later that night, he drove back to his home in Connecticut. At 11:30 p.m., he had his last ever conversation with his daughter. She called him to remind him to pick up the accident report forms from the Registry of Motor Vehicles. It was a normal, logistical conversation. Nothing in her tone suggested it would be their last. But sometime between that final phone call with her father and the next morning, something inside Maura Murray shifted. A plan, or at least the start of one, began to form. And this is where her digital life begins to tell a story that her physical actions only hint at. In the darkness of her dorm room, Maura Murray began to search. Her computer history would later reveal a series of queries made in the early hours of Monday, February 9th. She searched for directions to the Berkshires in western Massachusetts and to Burlington, Vermont. She looked up information on hotels and condominiums in the Bartlett, New Hampshire area, a popular ski resort town. These were not the searches of a student preparing for a week of classes. They were the searches of someone planning an escape. The morning of Monday, February 9th began with an act of deliberate deception. At 12:55 p.m., Maura sent an email from her UMass account to her nursing professors and to her supervisor at her campus job. The subject line was simple. Group clinical. The message was a lie. It read, "I am not going to be in clinical today or tomorrow because there is a death in my family. I will be in touch when I get back to school. I will have my cell phone with me if you need to reach me. Sincerely, Maura Murray." There was no death in the family. It was a fabrication designed to buy her time, to create a space of a few days where she would not be missed. After sending the email, her digital activity continued. At 1:13 p.m., she called a number for information about booking a condominium in Bartlett, New Hampshire. The call lasted for 3 minutes. She did not make a reservation. At 2:05 p.m., she called her boyfriend, Billy Rausch. It went to voicemail. She left a message, a soft, quiet message that he would later describe as sounding like she was crying. "I got your message," she said. "I love you. I miss you, stud. I love you. I'll talk to you later." It was the last message he would ever receive from her. At some point that day, she packed. She didn't pack for a week-long vacation. She packed as if she were moving out. She placed many of her belongings into cardboard boxes. She took the art off her dorm room walls and packed it. She packed textbooks, toiletries, clothing, and her birth control pills. She also packed a book, Not Without Peril, a collection of harrowing stories about hikers who died or disappeared on New Hampshire's Mount Washington. She left a printed email from Billy on top of the unmade bed, a detail that has been interpreted in countless ways. A clue, a sentimental keepsake, or a meaningless oversight. With her car packed, she began her final errands. At 3:15 p.m., she drove her black Saturn to a campus ATM and withdrew $280. This was almost all the money in her bank account. At around 3:40 p.m., she went to a liquor store and purchased about $40 worth of alcohol, a box of Franzia red wine, Kahlua, and a bottle of Bailey's Irish Cream. Security footage from the liquor store is the last known image of Maura Murray alive. She is alone. She appears calm. She is wearing a dark coat and her hair is up. From there, she drove north, away from her school, away from her family, away from the life she knew, heading towards the mountains of New Hampshire. The journey from Amherst, Massachusetts, to the White Mountains is about 2.5 to 3 hours. It's a drive that moves from the bustling academic towns of the Pioneer Valley into increasingly rural and remote landscapes. Route 112, also known as the Kankamagus Highway in one section, is a winding, scenic road that cuts through the heart of the White Mountain National Forest. In the winter, it can be treacherous, poorly lit, and with long stretches of intermittent to non-existent cell phone service. This is where Maura Murray was heading. Why she chose this specific route, this specific destination, remains one of the case's most profound mysteries. Was she going to the condominium complex she had researched? Was she planning to meet someone? Or was she simply driving with no destination in mind at all? At approximately 7 p.m., a resident of Haverhill, New Hampshire, heard a loud thump outside her house. A few minutes later, another local resident, a school bus driver named Butch Atwood, was driving his bus home when he came around a sharp corner, a spot known locally as the Weatherly Turn. He saw a car spun around and up against the snowbank on the side of the road. It was Maura's black Saturn. The windshield was cracked and the airbags had deployed. He pulled over. Butch Atwood saw a young woman standing outside the car. He asked her if she was okay, if she wanted him to call the police. The woman, presumed to be Maura, was, by his account, cold and shivering, but she refused his help. "No," she told him, "I've already called AAA." This was almost certainly a lie. With the poor cell service in that area, it's highly unlikely she could have made a call. Atwood, a man with first responder training, knew something was off. He saw no visible injuries, but he also sensed she did not want law enforcement involved. He pressed again, telling her he would have to call them anyway, as it was his civic duty. Still, she pleaded with him not to. Despite her pleas, Atwood drove the short distance to his home, just 100 yards up the road, and called 911. He reported a single-car accident on Route 112, noting the driver appeared uninjured but might have been drinking. The call was logged at 7:43 p.m. In that moment, a critical window opened. Between the time Butch Atwood left the scene to make his call and the time the first police officer arrived, there is a span of somewhere between 7 and 15 minutes. It is within this small, dark sliver of time that Maura Murray stepped out of her life and into thin air. At 7:46 p.m., Sergeant Cecil Smith of the Haverhill Police Department was dispatched to the scene. He arrived within 10 minutes. What he found was not a driver waiting for a tow truck, but an abandoned vehicle. The black Saturn was locked. The deployed airbags smelled of their recent ignition. The box of wine had spilled across the passenger seat and the floor. He could see a AAA card, a backpack, and school books. But there was no driver. There were no footprints leading away from the car into the deep snow on either side of the road. The road itself was dark, bordered by thick woods. Sergeant Smith and another officer who arrived shortly after searched the immediate vicinity with flashlights. They saw nothing. They heard nothing. It was as if the driver had simply evaporated. One of the most debated and perplexing clues was discovered that night. A clean white rag, possibly from Maura's roadside emergency kit, was found stuffed into the Saturn's tailpipe. The initial theory was that it was a desperate, if ill-informed, attempt to prevent the car from starting, something a person fleeing a DUI might try. Fred Murray, however, has long believed it was a signal of trouble, an old trick he taught his children to use if their car broke down to alert passing drivers that they were okay, but that the car was disabled. But police at the scene noted something else. The car still started perfectly fine, even with the rag in place. Was it a sign of a suicide attempt via carbon monoxide that she abandoned, or was it placed there by someone else entirely? Like every other piece of evidence in this case, the rag in the tailpipe is a question mark, a physical object that offers no solid answers, only more paths for speculation to travel down. The initial hours of the investigation were guided by a single, logical assumption. Maura Murray had crashed her car after drinking, and fearing a DUI charge, which would have violated the terms of her good behavior agreement from the credit card case, and could have jeopardized her future nursing license, she fled the scene. The police assumed she had gotten a ride from a passing motorist or was hiding nearby, waiting for the police to leave so she could come back for her car. They believed she would turn up by morning. She did not. When Maura failed to appear, a more serious search began. But crucial time had been lost. Any tracks she might have left had been obscured by passing traffic and the work of the tow truck driver who removed the Saturn. A search of the woods was organized, but the terrain was difficult, covered in several feet of snow. A tracking dog was brought in. The dog followed a scent from one of Maura's gloves found in the car for about 100 yards east on Route 112, and then the trail abruptly stopped. This suggested to investigators that she had gotten into a vehicle at that point. She didn't wander into the woods, she left the roadway. As the days turned into a week, Fred Murray and the rest of Maura's family arrived in New Hampshire, desperate for answers. They organized their own searches, plastering the area with missing person flyers. They spoke to the media, pleading for any information. Maura's boyfriend Billy Rausch flew in from Oklahoma, but the official investigation and the family's own frantic efforts turned up nothing. No sightings, no witnesses who saw her walking down the road, no one who admitted to picking up a young woman that night. The physical world offered no more clues. Maura Murray was gone, and it was at this point, as the trail in the snow grew cold, that a new trail, a digital one, began to catch fire. The disappearance of Maura Murray occurred at a unique technological crossroads. It was 2004. Social media, as we know it, did not exist. There was no Facebook, no Twitter, to amplify the search in its earliest days. But the Internet was very much alive with forums, message boards, and blogs, the primordial soup of online communities. And it was here that Maura's case took on a second life. It began with a simple website set up by her family, a digital version of a missing poster. But soon, her story was picked up by sites like Web Sleuths, a forum dedicated to unsolved mysteries. Here, a community of strangers began the painstaking process of dissecting every known detail of Maura's life and disappearance. They scrutinized the timeline. They debated the meaning of the rag in the tailpipe. They analyzed her final email and her last known phone calls. This was, in many ways, the birth of a phenomenon. A cold case was no longer the sole domain of law enforcement and grieving families. It was now open source. This digital investigation was supercharged by the work of a few key individuals, most notably a writer named James Renner. Renner became obsessed with the case, starting a blog called My Search for Maura Murray. He conducted his own interviews, tracked down witnesses, and floated provocative theories that often put him at odds with both Maura's family and law enforcement. His work, which culminated in a book, brought unprecedented attention to the case, but also introduced a new level of speculative narrative that was often presented with the weight of fact. The online world fractured into camps, each championing a different theory. These theories can be broadly grouped into three categories: that Maura succumbed to the elements or suicide, that she was the victim of foul play, or that she disappeared voluntarily to start a new life. Each theory feeds on the same small set of facts, but interprets them in vastly different ways. The theory of a voluntary disappearance is perhaps the most tantalizing because of Maura's own actions. She lied to her professors. She packed her belongings as if she were leaving for good. She withdrew nearly all her money. She was under immense personal and academic stress. Her father had just wrecked his car, and she was facing potential legal trouble. The idea that she simply wanted to escape it all is compelling. Proponents of this theory believe she had a destination in mind. Perhaps Canada, which is not far from where she vanished, and that a Confederate, a tandem driver in a second car, was either following her or waiting for her nearby. This tandem driver would have been the one to pick her up in that crucial 7 to 15-minute window after she crashed. Her disappearance, in this view, was not a tragedy but a success. She became a ghost because she wanted to. However, this theory has significant problems. In the 2 decades since she vanished, there has not been a single credible sighting of Maura Murray. She has never accessed her bank account. Her social security number has never been used. To successfully erase oneself so completely, without leaving any financial or digital footprint, is extraordinarily difficult. And why stage a car crash? If the plan was to disappear, why leave behind her car and her belongings as a starting point for an investigation? The second major theory is that Maura met with foul play. In this scenario, her crash was a random, unfortunate event that made her vulnerable. She was a young woman, alone on a dark road. An opportunistic predator could have stopped, offered her a ride, and then abducted and murdered her. This theory is supported by the tracking dog evidence, which suggests she got into a vehicle. It would explain the totality of her disappearance and the lack of any sign of her since. Over the years, online forums have been filled with speculation about various local men who had criminal records or who behaved suspiciously around the time Maura vanished. In 2018, this theory gained a new focus, acting on a tip that had been circulating in the online community for years. Investigators conducted a search of the basement of a house located very near the crash site. The tip suggested the former resident may have been involved. Cadaver dogs were brought in, and a portion of the concrete basement floor was excavated. The search, like so many before it, turned up nothing. Law enforcement has repeatedly stated that they have no credible evidence to suggest a particular person of interest is responsible for Maura's disappearance. The foul play theory remains just that, a theory, a dark shape in the absence of evidence. The final category of theories is that Maura died by exposure or suicide in the woods near the crash site. Perhaps, disoriented and intoxicated after the crash, she wandered into the forest to hide from the approaching police, became lost, and succumbed to the brutal New Hampshire winter. Her state of mind was clearly troubled. The book she packed, Not Without Peril, about death in the White Mountains, has been cited as a possible indicator of suicidal ideation. Fred Murray has always vehemently rejected this, pointing to the fact that his daughter was a skilled athlete and hiker who understood the dangers of the woods and would not have simply wandered into them unprepared in the dead of winter. Extensive searches of the area, both immediately after her disappearance and in the years since, have failed to find any trace of her. No remains, no clothing, no backpack. While it is certainly possible to disappear without a trace in the vast wilderness of the White Mountains, the complete lack of any evidence makes this theory as unproven as any other. This is the anatomy of the digital ghost. Maura Murray, the person, was a complex young woman dealing with real-world problems. But Maura Murray, the online entity, is something else entirely. She is a collection of data points to be endlessly reinterpreted. Her final email is not just a lie, but a coded message. The rag in the tailpipe is not just a rag, but a symbol. Every person in her life, from her father and boyfriend to the bus driver who was the last to see her, has had their motives and actions scrutinized and often vilified by thousands of strangers online. This crowdsourced investigation has, without a doubt, kept her case from being forgotten. It has generated tips and applied pressure on law enforcement to keep the case active, but it has also created a fog of misinformation, a chaotic swirl of rumor and accusation that has deeply wounded her family and may have ultimately hindered the official investigation. The digital world filled the vacuum, left by a lack of physical evidence, but it filled it with noise. It created a ghost woven from speculation, a narrative that has taken on a life of its own, separate from the facts of the case and separate from the flesh-and-blood woman who disappeared on that cold February night. For 2 decades, the search for Maura Murray has continued on 2 parallel tracks. The first is the official one, led by the New Hampshire State Police Cold Case Unit. It is a slow, methodical, and quiet investigation. They have pursued thousands of leads, conducted dozens of searches, and spent countless hours re-examining the evidence. They have access to information the public does not, but they remain bound by the protocols of law enforcement and a steadfast refusal to engage in public speculation. They maintain that Maura's case is still an open and active missing person investigation, but they have also acknowledged that it may involve criminal activity. In 2022, they added Maura's case to the state's cold case database and released an age-progressed photo of what she might look like in her 40s. The official search continues, grounded in the difficult reality of a case with no body, no crime scene, and no confession. The second track is the public one, a sprawling, decentralized effort driven by a global community of people who never knew Maura but feel like they do. It exists on Reddit, in Facebook groups, and in podcasts, most notably the Missing Maura Murray podcast, which has produced hundreds of episodes diving into every conceivable angle of the case. This public investigation is loud, chaotic, and emotional. It operates without rules of evidence, where theories can be built on the thinnest of connections and speculation can harden into accepted fact. At the center of it all for so many years was Fred Murray, a father who refused to let his daughter be forgotten. For years, he returned to New Hampshire every Columbus Day weekend to conduct his own searches. He has been a fierce critic of the New Hampshire State Police, accusing them of incompetence and of withholding information. He has filed lawsuits to obtain case files, desperate for any piece of information that might lead to an answer. His crusade has been relentless, a raw and public display of a father's grief and determination. He has chased down leads from psychics and anonymous tipsters, clinging to any shred of hope. His pain is the one undeniable, constant truth in a story otherwise defined by uncertainty. And so, the case sits in a strange stasis. Officially, it is a cold case, a box of files waiting for the one piece of evidence, the one phone call, that could finally break it open. In the public sphere, it is a raging fire, a constantly evolving narrative of theories and counter-theories. We are left with the same stark image from that night in February 2004, an empty car on a dark road, and a silence that has never been broken. What, then, is the ultimate anatomy of this case? It is the anatomy of a void. Maura Murray's disappearance is a landmark case, not because of its forensic complexity. There is precious little forensic evidence to analyze, but because of what it reveals about our relationship with mystery in the digital age, before the Internet, a case like this might have faded from public memory, becoming a local tragedy whispered about in small New Hampshire towns. Instead, it became a global obsession. Maura Murray left behind a finite set of digital breadcrumbs. A few emails, a handful of phone calls, a brief search history. This was the ghost she created for herself in the hours before she vanished. A faint outline of a plan, a suggestion of a troubled state of mind. But the ghost that exists today is one we all helped create. It is a vast, collaborative work of fiction and speculation, built to fill the unbearable emptiness of an unsolved case. The Internet abhors a vacuum of information, and in the absence of facts about Maura's fate, it has generated a universe of possibilities. She is alive in Canada. She is buried in a basement. She is the victim of a serial killer. She is a willing participant in the world's most elaborate game of hide-and-seek. The case of Maura Murray teaches us that a person can now disappear twice. First, they disappear in the physical world, leaving a hole in the lives of their loved ones. Then, they disappear a second time into the web of online speculation, where the real person is replaced by a character in a story, a puzzle to be solved, a ghost whose identity is debated by an audience of millions. The tragedy is that this digital ghost, for all the noise it generates, brings us no closer to the truth. It only deepens the shadows, obscuring the young woman who packed her car, lied to her teachers, and drove north into the cold, silent dark. In our hyper-connected world, Maura Murray accomplished something that should be impossible. She achieved absolute disconnection. She stepped out of her car and out of our world, leaving behind a silence that 20 years of technology and obsessive investigation have been unable to penetrate. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.